History books often record the final days of an empire with the sound of clashing swords or the triumphant cheers of a conquering army. But tonight, we will open a different page of history. A page where the most chilling prophecy was delivered not on a battlefield, but in the quiet, echoing halls of the White House. It was the 17th of January, 1961, a cold winter night in Washington. The air in the Oval Office was heavy, thick with the scent of aged cedar wood and the lingering smoke of a half-burned cigar. The man sitting behind the heavy wooden desk was not preparing to boast of his grand achievements or paint a glorious picture of tomorrow. He was an old general, tired and solitary, preparing to deliver a farewell address that sounded more like a plea for forgiveness from the future. If you are listening to this, I invite you to leave the chaos of today behind. Put away the loud news broadcasts, the flashing headlines about $100 billion weapons packages, and the endless, tiring debates of politicians. Right now, just pull your blanket up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow down. Close your eyes, and allow me to guide you back to a time over 60 years ago. Let us listen to the cold, quiet heartbeat of a machine that never sleeps, the very machine that still shapes the world outside your window tonight. To understand the weight of that winter night, we must first look at the hands of the man who spoke, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Before he wore the tailored suits of a president, he wore the mud-stained uniform of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. He was a man intimately acquainted with the geometry of death. In his memories, the fields of Europe were not painted in the romantic hues of victory. They were painted in the ash grey of burned villages, the deafening silence that followed an artillery barrage, and the endless rows of white crosses resting under the Normandy rain. He had seen what steel and fire could do to human flesh. He had watched a generation of young men march into the abyss of war, and when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, he carried with him a quiet, perhaps naive belief. He believed that the ocean of blood they had spilled would be enough to purchase eternal peace. He thought the massive factories that had churned out tanks and bombers would simply return to making tractors, civilian airplanes, and the tools of a quiet, prosperous life. While the world was busy celebrating the dawn of a peaceful era, in the shadows of towering steel mills and closed government boardrooms, a different kind of war was quietly being planned. When the old soldier stepped into the White House as president, he hoped to finally lay down his sword. He envisioned a presidency defined by rebuilding, by quiet diplomacy, and by the healing of a fractured world. But the corridors of power have a peculiar way of altering reality. Slowly, methodically, he began to realize that the throne he sat upon was not carved from the marble of peace. It was cast from the brass of new bullet casings. Every time he tried to pull back the military budget, to redirect the wealth of the nation towards schools, hospitals, and quiet domestic life, he met an invisible wall. It was not a wall of enemy soldiers holding rifles. It was a wall of polite men in sharp suits, carrying leather briefcases filled with lucrative contracts and terrifying intelligence reports. They spoke of gaps in missile defense, of encroaching red tides, of the absolute, undeniable necessity to stay armed to the teeth in the name of security. The general, who had commanded millions across turbulent oceans, found himself strangely paralyzed in his own capital. He realized that the very machinery built to defend the Republic was now beginning to consume it. The peace he had fought so bitterly to achieve had become nothing more than a brief intermission, a necessary pause to reload the weapons for a conflict that would never truly end. The silence of the Oval Office that evening was profound, yet it was a deceptive silence. Outside the heavily draped windows, the machinery of the nation hummed. It was a low, constant vibration that most people had simply learned to ignore. But Eisenhower felt it in his bones. He knew that across the country, massive assembly lines were operating under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Men and women, seeking nothing more than an honest wage to feed their families, were bolting together the fuselages of strategic bombers and refining the nuclear cores of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The wealth of a nation, the sweat of its laborers, and the brilliance of its scientists were being funneled into a bottomless well. He remembered the smell of the damp earth in the trenches, the metallic tang of blood in the air. Now, those visceral horrors were sanitized, reduced to neat columns of numbers on crisp white paper. The deaths of millions were being calculated as acceptable margins of error in a global chess game. The tragedy was no longer personal. It had become an industry. A cold, efficient, and endlessly profitable industry. The man who held the power to obliterate the world with a single command, ironically, felt entirely powerless to stop the very assembly line that produced those weapons. He felt the crushing weight of this realization. The Cold War had provided the perfect justification. Fear was the currency, and the defense industry was the central bank, printing it endlessly to keep the public compliant. He knew he was leaving office, stepping away from the levers of power, and handing them over to a younger, perhaps more idealistic generation. But he could not leave without speaking the truth. He could not walk out of those heavy doors without leaving a warning marker for those who would follow. He had to articulate the invisible danger that was quietly wrapping its metallic fingers around the heart of the society he had sworn to protect. So, he sat at his desk, picked up his pen, and prepared to deliver a speech that would be largely ignored by many in the moment, only to echo with chilling accuracy decades later. He was about to give a name to the monster hiding in plain sight. While the celebrations of victory still echoed in the streets, a profound anxiety began to settle over the massive industrial hubs of the nation. The transition was supposed to be a return to normalcy. But normalcy is a quiet, unassuming thing. Normalcy does not generate billions of dollars in revenue. As the troops came home, carrying their duffel bags and their invisible scars, the giant steel mills that had glowed red-hot through the nights, the sprawling assembly lines that had churned out fleets of bombers, were suddenly facing the terrifying prospect of silence. Peace, ironically, had brought with it a chilling new fear. The fear of idle hands, empty factories, and the haunting spectre of another Great Depression. The government could simply not allow the economic engine to stall. Hundreds of thousands of workers depended on those defense jobs to put bread on the table. The corporations that had grown powerful and obscenely wealthy on wartime production could not simply close their ledgers and walk away. They needed a reason to keep the blast furnaces burning. They needed a reason to keep the assembly lines moving. And if there was no active war to fight, then a new kind of war had to be invented. A war of perpetual waiting, a war of shadows and whispers. Thus began the long, quiet twilight of the Cold War. It was a brilliant, terrifying solution to an economic problem. The enemy was no longer a visible army marching across a physical border. The new enemy was an ideology, a creeping red tide that could theoretically strike at any moment from anywhere. This invisible threat was meticulously cultivated and carefully fed to the public. It was broadcast into quiet suburban living rooms through the static of black and white televisions. It was printed in bold, alarming headlines on the front pages of morning newspapers. The fear became the fuel. Citizens were instructed to build concrete fallout shelters beneath their manicured lawns, to practice duck and cover drills in brightly lit elementary schools. They were taught to look up at the starry night sky not with wonder, but with a quiet, lingering dread, imagining the silent trajectory of a nuclear warhead. In exchange for this constant, low-grade anxiety, the establishment promised ultimate protection. But that protection came with an astronomical, ever-expanding price tag. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, far from the public eye, a new kind of marriage was being formalized. It was a quiet alliance between the military brass, who were always hungry for the next technological advantage, and the industrial elite, who were eager to secure government contracts that guaranteed vast profits for decades. In soundproof rooms, over cups of black coffee and the scratching of fountain pens on crisp government paper, the fate of the national budget was decided. Taxpayer money began to flow in a silent, torrential river. It bypassed the crumbling infrastructure of quiet towns. It bypassed the underfunded schools and rural hospitals, flowing directly into the sterile, heavily guarded laboratories of defense contractors. Brilliant engineers in white coats were paid handsomely to design weapons of unimaginable destructive power. These were weapons that were never meant to be used on a battlefield, but simply to be possessed, to sit quietly in underground silos, maintaining the delicate, terrifying balance of mutual, assured destruction. The superficial prosperity that bloomed across American society during the 1950s was deeply entangled with this invisible machinery of death. The shiny new automobiles, the expanding suburbs, the overflowing supermarkets, they were all, in part, subsidized by an economy that had become hopelessly addicted to the preparation for a doomsday everyone silently prayed would never arrive. The nation had tied its economic well-being to the constant production of lethal force. Sitting at the very apex of this sprawling, complex ecosystem was President Eisenhower. He was a man of profound intellect, a strategist who understood the necessity of a strong national defense better than anyone. But he also understood the insidious nature of unchecked influence. From the quiet solitude of the Oval Office, he watched with growing unease as the tentacles of the defense industry crept deeper into the political structure of the country, like ivy slowly suffocating an old oak tree. He saw how congressional districts across the nation became entirely dependent on the jobs provided by these massive weapons manufacturers. He realized a terrifying political truth. A politician who voted to reduce military spending was essentially voting to put their own constituents out of work. It was an unbreakable, self-perpetuating cycle, a perfectly designed political trap. The general, who had outmaneuvered the greatest military minds of the Axis powers, found himself outflanked by the very system he was supposed to command. Every time he sought to ease diplomatic tensions, every time he proposed a reduction in the standing army or a freeze on nuclear testing, he encountered a fierce, invisible resistance. This resistance did not come from foreign adversaries. It came from respected, patriotic men in tailored suits, men who sat on the boards of aerospace companies and walked the polished halls of Capitol Hill. They spoke with grave, serious voices about the missile gap, about the imminent threat of foreign supremacy, about the absolute duty to remain the strongest nation on earth. But beneath their patriotic rhetoric, beneath the noble speeches about defending freedom, Eisenhower could hear the cold, rhythmic clinking of coins. He realized, with a profound and heavy sorrow, that the pursuit of peace had become inherently unprofitable. There was no money to be made in diplomacy. There were no lucrative, multi-billion-dollar contracts to be signed for disarmament or mutual understanding. The massive fortunes of this new complex relied entirely on keeping the world standing perpetually on the edge of the abyss, forever preparing for a war it simply could not afford to fight. People have always been led to believe that the ultimate, terrifying power in the modern world rests beneath the fingertips of the president, hovering quietly over a red nuclear button. But the cold, unspoken truth of history is quite different. The real power, the power that shapes borders and dictates the lifespan of empires, does not reside in a dramatic launch sequence or a sudden declaration of war. It is quietly nestled within the mundane, neatly bound pages of third-quarter profit reports circulated on mahogany tables by defense contractors. Let us look closer at this intricate, invisible machinery. It is a structure so elegantly designed, so perfectly balanced in its mutual self-interest, that it almost defies dismantling. Imagine a triangle forged from cold, impenetrable steel. At one corner, you have the military establishment, the generals and admirals whose careers, prestige, and influence depend on having the most advanced, the most lethal, and the most abundant weaponry available. They represent the eternal, insatiable demand. At the second corner sit the massive industrial corporations. These are the sprawling entities with assembly lines stretching for miles, employing tens of thousands of voters whose singular purpose is to manufacture the supply. And at the third, crucial corner, are the politicians, the lawmakers whose very political survival depends entirely on keeping those factories open, keeping those workers employed, and keeping those campaign donations flowing smoothly into their re-election funds. When these three forces lock together, they form a self-sustaining ecosystem of perpetual conflict. The decisions that send thousands of young men and women into the dust and mud of foreign lands are rarely made in the heat of passion or out of deep-seated ideological hatred. Those decisions are born in profound, chilling silence. Imagine a high-altitude boardroom in a glass skyscraper, isolated from the noise and the dirt of the city below. The air conditioning hums a steady, soft note, a mechanical lullaby masking the weight of the discussions. The thick carpets absorb the sound of expensive leather shoes. Men in tailored suits sit around a polished table, pouring vintage wine into crystal glasses that catch the late afternoon sunlight. They speak in hushed, measured tones, examining spreadsheets filled with abstract numbers. To them, the deployment of a carrier strike group or the approval of a massive new artillery package is not a matter of life, death, and human suffering. It is a logistical variable. It is a line item on an accounting ledger. It is a carefully calculated strategy to satisfy shareholders and secure the next fiscal year's budget. The contrast is enough to make one's blood run cold, yet it happens so quietly that it barely registers as a tragedy to those involved. While a mother halfway across the globe weeps over the ruined foundation of her home, shattered by an explosive shell, a lobbyist in Washington is calmly shaking hands over a perfectly cooked steak, celebrating the successful passage of a defense appropriation bill. There is no malice in that handshake. There is no personal animosity toward the people whose lives have just been irrevocably altered. It is merely the frictionless, emotionless gears of commerce turning exactly as they were designed to turn. It is the banality of modern warfare, reduced to a simple business transaction. President Eisenhower, a man who had stared into the eyes of dying soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, understood this disconnect intimately. As he spent his days in the Oval Office, reviewing intelligence briefings and budget proposals, he felt the suffocating grip of this new reality tightening around him. He had spent his entire military career learning how to defeat visible enemies, how to outmaneuver opposing armies on a physical map. But how do you defeat an enemy that is woven into the very fabric of your own economy? How do you disarm a mechanism that wears the mask of patriotism, national security, and economic prosperity? He realized, with a quiet, devastating clarity, that he had been entirely stripped of his weapons in a war being fought on his own soil. The prestigious realized title of Commander-in-Chief felt increasingly hollow, a ceremonial role masking a profound powerlessness. His efforts to rein in the sprawling defense budget were consistently met with polite smiles, respectful nods, and then completely ignored by the invisible bureaucracy that truly governed the direction of the nation. He was the captain of a massive ship, standing at the helm, turning the wheel with all his might, only to discover that the steering cables had been quietly severed, replaced by an automated navigation system programmed solely for the pursuit of endless military dominance. Let us linger in that silent realization for a moment. Imagine the long, solitary nights Eisenhower spent wandering the quiet halls of the executive mansion, the painted portraits of past presidents staring down at him from the shadows, men who had navigated their own historical crises, but none had faced an adversary quite so intangible and systemic. He would look out the window across the darkened lawn, knowing that at that exact second, deep underground, in fortified concrete bunkers across the Midwest, young men in crisp uniforms were sitting at metal consoles, turning identical keys in a grim, silent rehearsal for the end of the world. And he knew that the companies that built those consoles, the contractors who poured the thousands of tons of concrete for those silos, were experiencing unprecedented financial growth. The paradox was agonizing. The more weapons the nation built to feel secure, the more insecure the world became, and consequently, the more weapons were demanded. It was a flawless, terrifying feedback loop. The military-industrial complex did not need to actively instigate a world war. It simply needed to maintain the constant, simmering illusion that war was always just over the horizon. A minor diplomatic incident in a small, unheard-of country would be artificially amplified, dissected on the evening news, and presented as an existential threat, justifying the immediate allocation of billions of dollars for new fighter jets or experimental submarine technology. Eisenhower saw the very soul of the Republic slowly changing before his eyes. The immense resources being poured into the machinery of death meant that other vital parts of society were being quietly starved. The money that could have built schools, laid down new highways, or funded medical research was instead locked away in the cold, titanium belly of a nuclear submarine that would never see combat, or spent on fleets of bombers destined to sit on isolated tarmacs until they were quietly decommissioned and replaced by newer, vastly more expensive models. It was a quiet theft of the nation's future, an invisible tax levied not on their wallets, but on their potential to evolve as a peaceful society. He was watching the slow, irreversible transformation of a democracy into a garrison state, where the ultimate authority rested not with the voting public, but with the unseen architects of perpetual readiness. And knowing his time was running out, he knew he had to speak. If you have your eyes closed right now, I want you to try and imagine the soft, static hum of a black and white television set in the winter of 1961. Through the grainy, flickering picture, the warm, gravelly voice of the old general begins to speak. It is a voice that carries the immense weight of a long, exhausting life, echoing with a profound, almost desperate solitude. He sat upright in his chair, staring directly into the cold glass lens of the camera, looking past the blinding studio lights and trying to reach the quiet living rooms of millions of ordinary citizens. He was not asking them to prepare for an incoming nuclear attack. He was not asking them to buy war bonds or to mobilize for another glorious crusade across the ocean. He was asking them to wake up. With slow, deliberate enunciation, pausing to let each syllable sink into the silence, he introduced a phrase that would forever haunt the American conscience. In the councils of government, he said, his voice steady but laced with a subtle, unmistakable sorrow, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, 3 simple words, strung together to describe a colossal, unfeeling beast. Listen carefully to how he phrased that warning. He did not say this influence was a malicious, secret conspiracy. He explicitly said it was whether sought or unsought. That is perhaps the most terrifying part of his realization. It meant that the system did not need evil men to operate. It only needed ambitious men, pragmatic men, men who were simply doing their daily jobs within a massive structure that rewarded the endless, profitable preparation for violence. He warned of the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power. He foresaw a bleak future where public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific and technological elite. A future where the democratic process, the quiet voice of the farmer tending his fields, the teacher in her classroom, the factory worker heading home in the dusk, would be entirely drowned out by the deafening roar of defense lobbyists and the silent, undeniable logic of multi-billion-dollar military contracts. He knew, better than anyone alive, that when the economic livelihood of a nation depends on building weapons of mass destruction, that nation will inevitably, eventually, find a reason to use them. When the broadcast ended that night, the television sets flickered off, leaving millions of homes in quiet, comfortable darkness. For a brief moment, the warning hung in the air like a fragile spiderweb swaying in the breeze, but it was quickly swept away. The new decade was dawning, bringing with it a young, charismatic new president, a thrilling race to the moon, and a society hopelessly distracted by the shimmering, neon promises of the future. The old general retired to his farm in Gettysburg, watching helplessly from his porch as his prophecy began to unfold, word for chilling word. Now, let us slowly fast forward the heavy tape of history. Let the decades pass behind your closed eyelids like fleeting shadows cast by a flickering candle on a bedroom wall. The 1960s bleed into the 70s. The quiet hum of the domestic defense factories erupts into the deafening, chaotic roar of the Vietnam War. Imagine the thick, suffocating humidity of the jungle canopy, the violent, rhythmic whirring blades of thousands of transport helicopters carrying young, frightened boys into the dark unknown, the earth burning with chemical fire, leaving scars that would last for generations. And simultaneously, An ocean away, picture the pristine, air-conditioned offices on Wall Street, where the stock prices of aerospace contractors and chemical manufacturers climbed to unprecedented, dizzying heights. It was the absolute, horrific realization of Eisenhower's fear, the blood of the citizen becoming the very fertilizer for corporate wealth. And the machine did not stop there. It never stops. It merely takes a breath, recalibrates, and renames its targets. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall crumbled to dust under the hands of hopeful citizens. But the sprawling factories could not be allowed to close. The assembly lines could not simply stop moving. New enemies were promptly, conveniently found in the shifting, endless sands of the Middle East. The rugged mountains of Afghanistan and the ancient deserts of Iraq became the new, highly profitable testing grounds for the next generation of precision-guided munitions. Trillions of dollars vanished into the arid wind, leaving behind fractured nations and silent graveyards, while the ledger books in the Pentagon and corporate headquarters remained perfectly balanced. And what about today? If you open your eyes for just a moment to look at the world right now, you will see the ultimate culmination of that winter night in 1961. $100 billion weapons packages are approved with the rapid, unthinking stroke of a legislative pen. Massive grey cargo planes, heavy with the weight of artillery shells, smart missiles, and unmanned drones, take off into the night sky, destined for the frozen battlefields of Eastern Europe or the contested, burning territories of the Middle East. The rhetoric, broadcasted on the evening news, is always the same. It is always beautifully framed in the noble, uplifting language of defending democracy, securing global peace, and protecting fundamental human freedom. But underneath the patriotic speeches, underneath the solemn diplomatic handshakes captured by flashing cameras, the cold, underlying truth remains entirely unchanged. The assembly lines must be fed. The profit margins must be strictly maintained. The military-industrial complex is no longer just a dark shadow lurking in the corridors of government. It has become the very foundation of the global geopolitical order. It is an entity so vast, so deeply entrenched in the economic DNA of the modern world, that no single president, no single government possesses the power to dismantle it. It breathes through the continuous, rhythmic drumbeat of distant conflicts. It feeds on the endless, manufactured anxiety of a world kept perpetually on the brink of disaster. The old general tried to warn us. He tried to tell us that a nation that spends more money on its military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a slow, spiritual death. But his weary voice was, in the end, ultimately swallowed by the endless roar of the engines. But as we lie here tonight, in the quiet safety of this moment, we must remember that history is a long, undulating river. It is easy to feel small, to feel entirely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of these invisible forces, by the trillions of dollars and the massive arsenals that seemingly dictate the fate of the world. But let us take a slow, deep breath and look at this sprawling machinery through a different lens, the lens of time, the lens of impermanence. Every empire that has ever existed, from the sun-drenched marble columns of Rome to the vast, wind-swept steppes of the Mongol Khans, believed it was eternal. They, too, built weapons of unimaginable scale for their eras. They, too, believed that iron, blood, and wealth could secure their power forever. Yet, where are they now? Their impenetrable fortresses are nothing but scattered stones, quietly overgrown by moss and wild vines. Their terrifying war machines are rusted relics, slowly disintegrating in quiet museums. The men who commanded them, the politicians who plotted in secret, the generals who ordered armies into the abyss. They all eventually needed nothing more than a small plot of earth to rest. The military-industrial complex, despite its current, overwhelming dominance, is bound by the exact same laws of nature. It is a structure built entirely upon the fragile foundation of human fear and the illusion of control. And illusions, no matter how heavily fortified, cannot last forever. The billions of dollars changing hands in those quiet boardrooms, the intricate geopolitical chess games. In the grand scheme of the universe, They are as fleeting as a sigh in the winter wind. They cannot buy a single moment of genuine peace. They cannot purchase the quiet serenity you feel when you simply close your eyes and let go of the day's burdens. So, let the noise of the news fade away. The world outside will continue to turn. The politicians will continue to argue, and the factories will continue their metallic rhythm. But none of that belongs to you in this moment. You do not have to carry the weight of history on your shoulders tonight. You are safe. You are warm. The air you breathe is free from the smoke of the past. Think of the old general, Eisenhower, walking the quiet fields of his farm in his final years. Even he, after carrying the burden of global war and the terrifying knowledge of the future, had to eventually lay it all down. He had to accept that he had done all he could and that the rest belonged to the mysterious unfolding of time. We, too, must learn to lay down our worries. The struggles of empires and the greed of corporations are temporary, but the quiet, steady rhythm of your own heart, the deep, comforting stillness of the night, these are the things that truly endure. Let your mind drift away from the Pentagon, away from the assembly lines, and sink deeper into the soft embrace of your bed. The past is a story that has already been told, and the future is a shadow that has not yet arrived. There is only now, a profound, healing emptiness. If this quiet journey through history has helped you find a moment of peace tonight, please consider leaving a gentle subscription to the channel. May your mind be clear, and may your dreams be completely free from the echoes of the world. Sleep well, and we will meet again in another quiet corner of the past tomorrow night.